what if the foundational system designed to keep the American government running, the essential checks from air traffic control to food safety, is systematically being weaponized, forcing a pause every year?
It's a scenario we see playing out again and again.
We are diving deep today into the countdown to the September 30th cliff. That's the mandated deadline for funding the new fiscal year, 2026.
Right.
This is the ultimate deep dive on the USA government shutdown risk. We're analyzing the legal trap, the profound human cost, and, well, the lasting economic shockwaves.
We're aiming to give you the blueprint, really, for decoding this high-stakes political drama.
This is more than just another headline. It feels like a systemic failure point.
It absolutely is, and we are going to provide you with the analysis and context that really matters. We want to transform this complex world of appropriations and continuing resolutions into clear, actionable knowledge.
So by the end of this conversation on the KaiZen channel, you won't just know when the deadline is.
No, you'll understand why the system itself is repeatedly triggered. And crucially, what political dynamics to watch for as the brinkmanship escalates.
We know our audience here at KaiZen is incredibly informed. You follow global events, markets.
Definitely.
So here's a quick challenge for you. Knowing what you know about the current political climate, do you believe Congress will pass all 12 necessary appropriations bills on time this year? Avoiding a shutdown entirely.
What do you think?
Just share 0 for no or 1 for yes right now in the comments.
Yeah.
Let us know your gut feeling.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see the consensus.
Welcome back to KaiZen. Our mission today is laser focused on unpacking the sources surrounding the Government USA Shutdown 2025 scenario.
Right.
We're zooming in on that deadline.
Right.
Midnight, September 30th, 2025, when funding for fiscal year, or FY 2026, must be approved.
And honestly, for anyone tracking the stability of the world's largest economy, or even just concerned about basic services, this deep dive is pretty essential.
We aren't just summarizing headlines here.
No, not at all. We are digging into the precise legal and mechanical failures that create this scenario. We'll look at the specific, often painful consequences for the American people.
And that's everyone from, uniformed military personnel to maybe small business owners waiting on a loan.
Exactly. And we'll place it all within the broader, recurring economic context. We'll demonstrate why this is really a systemic challenge, rooted deep in law and, frankly, political calculation.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. It's not just a failure of negotiation. Like, two sides can't agree.
Right. It's more fundamental than that.
It's a profound political calculation that actually leverages an obscure 19th century law to force compliance.
That's the core of it.
We are analyzing the mechanics of an event that has been played out, 21 times since 1980. It's kind of shocking when you see the number.
It is. It's become almost routine, which is the problem. Okay, so to truly master the analysis of a potential shutdown, you absolutely must first understand the foundational legal requirement.
It's not like the government can just print money whenever it wants.
Not at all. The federal government cannot simply spend money as it sees fit. It relies heavily on annual appropriations approved by Congress. That's the key phrase, annual appropriations.
And this funding is currently divided up how?
It's split into 12 major appropriations bills. These cover, well, everything. National defense, health research, the general operating expenses for the entire federal bureaucracy.
So 12 bills Congress needs to pass each year.
Correct. And that leads directly to the clock they are racing against. The mandatory start of the federal fiscal year is always October 1st.
Always October 1st. Got it.
So if Congress fails to pass those 12 annual appropriations bills, and importantly, the president has not signed them into law by midnight on September 30th, 2025.
Then what?
Any unfunded agency instantly shuts down, period.
And this isn't just tradition, it's hard law, right? From the Constitution.
Absolutely. The U.S. Constitution provides the foundation. It states clearly, Article 1, Section 9, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law.
No wiggle room there.
Zero wiggle room. That mandate is absolute. But in reality,
Congress rarely hits that deadline for all 12 bills, do they?
very rarely. It's become the exception rather than the rule. So what happens instead, and this is a staggering number, what we've seen used 47 times just between fiscal year 2010 and 2022.
47 times.
Wow. Is the deployment of these stopgap measures. They're called continuing resolutions, or CRs.
CRs. Okay, I've heard that term a lot. They're basically political adrenaline shots. keep things going temporarily.
That's a good way to put it. They allow agencies to continue operating, usually at the prior year's spending levels, for a short period. Maybe 6 weeks, maybe 3 months.
Just buying time for Congress to negotiate the final bills.
Exactly. They buy time. But CRs come with a hidden cost, don't they? They're not a perfect solution.
Right. It feels like kicking the can down the road.
It is. They are not really governance. They are fundamentally delay. And because CRs usually maintain prior year spending levels, they can include complex policy riders attached to them.
Ah, so policy fights get bundled in.
They often do. And crucially, CRs typically include prohibitions on new starts.
New starts. What does that mean in practice?
Well, think about an agency like NASA wanting to launch a major new space probe initiative. Or maybe the Department of Energy trying to kick off a big clean energy research project.
Or the EPA starting a complex environmental cleanup?
Precisely. If they are operating under a CR, they generally can't initiate any significant new programs or substantially increase funding for existing ones, even if Congress ultimately intends to fund them.
So they're just stuck.
They are stuck in a holding pattern, sometimes for half the fiscal year or more. This makes effective long-term program management incredibly difficult, almost impossible sometimes.
So vital research, innovation, infrastructure projects, they're just perpetually stalled by this CR cycle.
That's often the practical effect, yes. It creates inefficiency and uncertainty.
Okay, so the system is designed for spending authority to expire annually. The political process frequently fails to renew it on time, leading to CRs. But the real legal muscle that forces the government to actually cease operations, the thing that turns a funding delay into a full-blown shutdown, that's something else, right?
That is the absolute key. That's the simple trick to understanding this whole event. It's the Anti-Deficiency Act.
The Anti-Deficiency Act. Okay, let's dig into that.
This act, which actually originated way back in 1870 and was formalized into its modern enforcement structure in the 1980s, is really the engine of the shutdown.
1870. That's surprising. So it's not a new law causing this?
Not at all. But its interpretation and strict enforcement are more modern, and it is severe. It prohibits any federal official from entering into obligations.
Obligations meaning spending money, making commitments, signing contracts.
Exactly. Any of that.
Yeah.
Without prior specific appropriations from Congress.
But I have to ask this. If the money usually comes through eventually, right, via a CR or a final budget bill, why is the penalty for spending before it arrives so severe?
That's a great question.
Doesn't that force this massive, costly stoppage? Even if a solution might only be hours or days away, why can't they just, float expenses temporarily? Assume the money's coming.
Because the original goal of the Act, back in the 19th century, was precisely to prevent unauthorized overspending by executive agencies. It was about maintaining congressional control over the power of the purse.
Okay, keeping spending in check.
Right. And the key is that the law, as written and interpreted, makes no distinction between a temporary delay in funding and a permanent absence of funds. If the appropriation isn't there at midnight, September 30th, the authority is gone.
Wow. No gray area.
Very little. The Anti-Deficiency Act only provides an extremely narrow legal escape hatch, an exception only for emergencies involving the safety of human life or the protection of property.
That distinction, emergencies involving the safety of human life or the protection of property, that sounds like it covers very little of what the government actually does day to day.
It covers essential functions, but yes, it's incredibly narrow. Think air traffic control, certain law enforcement, maybe critical medical care in federal facilities. But not routine operations, not research, not processing applications.
So this severe legal framing forces the government to cease all these other non-accepted activities immediately.
Immediately. And failure to comply isn't just a slap on the wrist. It can result in administrative discipline, fines, or even potential criminal sanctions for the federal official who authorizes the spending.
Criminal sanctions. Okay, that explains the urgency.
Absolutely. That's why you see agency heads scramble, as they're required to by the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, to prepare these incredibly detailed contingency plans.
The shutdown plans.
Right. Identifying exactly which personnel, job function by job function, qualify under that narrow accepted definition and who must be sent home furloughed.
So it creates a situation where just being prudent and following the law dictates that you must stop everything.
You must stop. You have to follow the Anti-Deficiency Act. Even if you suspect Congress will likely pass a funding bill soon, it is mandatory.
And that legal structure is what elevates a political disagreement over spending levels or policy riders into a full-blown national operational crisis.
That's the mechanism in a nutshell. Tag 3, the politics and the human cost.
Okay, so we have this mandatory legal requirement crashing headlong into the current political climate. And sources suggest that the political division right now makes reaching an agreement look exceptionally bleak heading into the FY 2026 deadline.
That seems to be the consensus, unfortunately. We see the brinkmanship surface almost immediately in these budget cycles.
Like what? What are the recent examples?
Well, in recent budget fights, we've seen, for instance, Republicans push for short-term measures, maybe clean CRs, but then face immediate pushback from Democrats demanding specific policy writers.
Things like?
Things like extending Affordable Care Act tax credits, or maybe reversing specific proposed cuts to Medicaid funding, things that are core priorities for them.
And those policy demands aren't minor details, are they? They represent fundamental ideological conflicts.
Absolutely not minor. Extending the ACA tax credits, for example, involves billions of dollars and is central to the Democratic Party's platform on healthcare access and affordability.
So, for Republicans maybe focused on fiscal restraint or reducing the size of government, those demands get immediately labeled what? Non-starters.
Exactly. That's the term we often hear, as noted in our sources, non-starter, which immediately signals deadlock.
And this kind of high-stakes legislative brinkmanship, it feels like the default setting now for budget negotiations, doesn't it?
It really does. You look back at the longest shutdown in U.S. history, the one from 2018 to 2019.
35 days.
Right around there, yes. And what triggered it? It was triggered entirely by a dispute over funding for the border wall. A single, highly contentious policy issue held up funding for large parts of the government.
And this predictable cyclical impasse, where the budget process itself is used as a weapon, what does that do to public trust?
It leads to a rapid, measurable erosion of public trust in Congress, in political leadership generally. Researchers like Carlin Bowman, writing for Forbes back in 2025, consistently noted this phenomenon.
It just suggests to the public that Congress is incapable of performing its most basic constitutional duty, funding the government.
Precisely. It feeds cynicism and gridlock narratives.
Okay, so when that clock does hit midnight on September 30th and the Anti-Deficiency Act kicks in, the first people who feel the immediate, really devastating consequences are the federal workers and their families.
Absolutely. The human cost is immediate and significant. We are talking about potentially nearly 3% of the entire U.S. labor force being directly affected.
3%, that's huge. How many people is that?
Well, think about past shutdowns like 2013 or 2018-19. You saw roughly 800,000 federal employees furloughed, and potentially impacting up to 4 million federal contractors as well, whose payments stop.
And given the size of the government today, a full shutdown could easily mean what? Maybe 900,000 federal workers furloughed?
Easily. It could approach 1 million households whose financial stability is instantly compromised. They're forced to make incredibly difficult choices about paying rent, buying groceries, childcare.
It's critical we clarify the terminology here because it dictates who stays home and who has to work, but without pay.
Exactly. We have to distinguish between the two main categories of employees during a shutdown.
Okay, lay them out for us.
First, you have furloughed employees. These are the individuals sent home without pay. Their job duties are not deemed necessary to protect life or property under that very narrow definition in the Anti-Deficiency Act.
Sent home, no pay. Got it. And the second group?
The second group is accepted employees. These employees are required to report for work immediately, but crucially without pay during the shutdown period.
Required to work for free, essentially.
For the duration of the funding lapse, yes. Their duties fall under that narrow life and property exception. Think air traffic controllers, border patrol agents, TSA screeners at airports, federal prison guards.
Critical functions, clearly.
Yes, functions deemed essential to immediate safety and security.
Now, that distinction is vital, but I think the language often used in the media misses the point entirely. That term, non-essential.
Ugh, yes. That term is officially discouraged by the government itself.
It's just wrong and, frankly, demeaning.
It's both. It's a total misnomer. These are dedicated professionals committed to public service. Agencies prefer the term non-accepted because it accurately reflects their legal status under the Anti-Deficiency Act, not their importance to the country or the agency's mission.
But when the headlines scream non-essential workers sent home, what does that do long-term to morale, to recruitment for these vital agencies?
It fundamentally undermines the civil service. It's incredibly damaging. You had that EPA employee during the 2013 shutdown saying, "We love public service, but it's just too unstable."
Right. The perceived main benefit of a government job, The stability, the reliable income just vanishes instantly during these events.
It evaporates, and that stability risk applies equally to the millions of federal contractors trying to staff complex, long-term projects. It creates a massive hurdle for retaining and recruiting the top talent needed for critical national priorities, whether it's infrastructure, scientific research, or cutting-edge defense technologies. Who wants that uncertainty?
And the impact on our active duty military personnel? That seems uniquely painful and maybe even dangerous.
It is. They're legally required to report for duty. Readiness can't stop. But they face the immediate threat of going without pay.
And we're not just talking about missing one paycheck being an inconvenience. For many service members and their families, the financial margin is razor thin, isn't it?
It really is. The statistics are quite sobering. Sources show that back in 2022, over 25% of enlisted active duty military families reported experiencing food insecurity.
1 in 4 families struggling with food while serving the country.
Yes. And for service members of color, the likelihood of reporting that level of financial distress was actually twice as high.
That's shocking.
It is. So pay uncertainty during a shutdown just amplifies this immense pre-existing stress. Imagine being deployed overseas, worrying about whether your family back home can buy groceries because of political gridlock in Washington. It forces families to deplete emergency savings, rely on loans or aid just to keep the lights on.
And there's a crucial detail here, a bureaucratic complexity from the 2018-2019 shutdown that often gets forgotten. The military impact wasn't uniform across all branches, was it?
No, it wasn't, and this highlights the absurdity sometimes. The Coast Guard was the only military branch affected by that specific funding lapse.
Only the Coast Guard. Why? They perform critical national security missions.
It comes down purely to administrative placement within the government structure. The Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps are funded under the Department of Defense, the DoD.
And Congress usually passes the DoD funding bill separately, and often earlier.
Correct. The Defense Appropriations Bill is often prioritized and passed standalone, shielding most DoD personnel from the shutdown drama affecting other agencies.
But the Coast Guard, they fall under a different department.
Exactly. Administratively, the Coast Guard is housed within the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, and DHS funding relies on a general appropriations bill that frequently gets snarled in broader political disputes, like the border wall funding fight back then.
So purely because of which bureaucratic box they sit in, DoD members got paid. But the Coast Guard, doing critical maritime safety, drug interdiction, search and rescue, saw their paychecks delayed.
That's right. The delay hit active duty pay, benefits for civilian Coast Guard workers, and even pay for Coast Guard retirees.
That must have been incredibly stressful. I know organizations like Navy Federal Credit Union step up with specific government shutdown programs offering zero-interest loans, essentially.
They do, and those programs are lifelines. But the very need for these emergency programs illustrates the severity of the immediate financial hit these families take through no fault of their own.
And beyond pay, the stress extends to basic employee rights and scheduling, doesn't it?
It does. A shutdown is legally categorized as an adverse action. This provides certain notice and appeal rights, but it also means disruption. For instance, agencies are generally required by the Anti-Deficiency Act rules to cancel any previously scheduled paid time off, annual leave, sick leave for employees unless that employee is designated as accepted.
So planned vacations get canceled, family trips lost.
Yes. Canceled vacations, lost deposits on flights or hotels, heightened family strain, all triggered by a political failure hundreds or thousands of miles away. It adds another layer of frustration and instability to federal service.
Okay, so amidst the chaos, it's important to clarify which public services do keep running. The key distinction, again, is mandatory versus discretionary spending.
Right. Mandatory spending continues automatically.
Generally, yes. Services funded by mandatory spending continue uninterrupted because their funding doesn't rely on those annual appropriations bills.
And what are the big ones people rely on? The biggest are the major entitlement programs: Social Security payments, Medicare, and Medicaid. If you rely on those checks or services, they will continue to arrive or be available. The funding mechanism is separate.
That's a huge relief for millions. What else keeps going?
Well, we can't forget two major, highly visible operations that continue despite congressional failure to pass appropriations.
Okay.
First, the U.S. Postal Service, USPS. It's fully independent financially.
Funded by stamps and services, not taxes directly.
Exactly. It's funded through the sale of its products and services, not by annual appropriations. So mail delivery continues without disruption, That's crucial.
Definitely. And the second?
Second, the core constitutional checks are maintained. The president and cabinet members continue working. Their salaries are funded differently. And importantly, Article 3 federal judges...
Supreme Court, district courts, circuit courts of appeals.
Right. Those judges keep receiving their salary because the Constitution explicitly forbids reducing their compensation while they are in office. It's a separation of powers safeguard.
Okay, so Social Security, Medicare, mail, the president, top judges, they continue.
Correct. But once we shift to the vast array of services funded by discretionary spending, the things Congress has to approve funding for every single year, that's where the pain points become immediate and highly visible to the average American and even global travelers visiting the U.S.
Okay, let's dive into the specifics of what truly shuts down and the direct impact it has on citizens' lives. First up, a really visible one, national parks and public lands.
Yes, these often become symbols of the shutdown. They face overflowing trash bins because maintenance crews are furloughed, restrooms locked, visitor centers closed, campgrounds shut down.
It basically becomes ghost towns, or worse, right?
Mm-hmm.
Didn't we see actual damage during the 2018-19 shutdown?
We did. Irreparable damage in some cases. That specific detail you might remember about protected Joshua trees being cut down illegally in Joshua Tree National Park because there were no rangers on patrol.
That's awful. That's not just inconvenience. That's lasting environmental damage caused directly by political failure.
It absolutely is. And that anecdote is critical because it moves beyond mere financial loss or inconvenience. When these treasured sites are unstaffed, the risk of vandalism, resource damage, and public safety incidents skyrockets.
And there's a financial hit too, right? Lost revenue.
Significant lost revenue. For instance, the National Park Service lost about $7 million in entrance fees and other revenue during the relatively short 2013 shutdown alone. Those are funds desperately needed for park upkeep, trail maintenance, conservation efforts, meaning taxpayers effectively pay twice once operations finally resume, and the backlog of work needs to be addressed.
Okay, next. Public safety. This feels even more serious. What happens with food safety?
This is a major concern. The FDA's food safety inspections, routine inspections of processing plants, imported foods, are largely stopped or drastically reduced.
So they only respond to emergencies.
Pretty much. They become limited only to immediate high-risk emergency situations. Long-term food safety initiatives, the kind of preventative work that stops outbreaks before they happen, including crucial monitoring for foodborne illnesses like E. coli or salmonella, are halted.
That must create widespread consumer anxiety. I remember during the 2018-2019 shutdown, there were real concerns being raised about the safety of imported produce or maybe domestic meat processing plants.
Absolutely, because that routine preventative oversight just vanishes overnight. It starkly illustrates how a budget failure in Washington can translate directly into a potential public health risk on your dinner plate or at the grocery store.
Okay, let's talk money. Taxes. What happens at the IRS?
Prepare for massive delays and service disruptions if a shutdown occurs, especially near tax season. The IRS stops most enforcement activities.
Which, ironically, costs the government money, right?
Yeah.
Because enforcement brings in revenue.
Yeah. Exactly. Enforcement normally collects about $1 billion per week for the Treasury. So halting that actually worsens the deficit temporarily. But for the average person, the impact is felt elsewhere. Tax filing assistance, those taxpayer assistance centers you can walk into, telephone helplines, they are largely halted.
But the big one for most people is tax refunds, isn't it?
That's the critical impact for millions of households and businesses. The processing and issuing of tax refunds can be significantly delayed.
How much are we talking?
Well, back in 2013, roughly $3.7 billion in refunds were held up. And a shutdown can also delay the start of the next tax filing season itself.
Really? Why?
Because the complex computer programming, the updating of forms, the rigorous testing needed to process new tax codes and ensure accuracy, much of that work can't be completed on schedule if the IRS staff are furloughed. This can push the start date back by up to 2 weeks.
Wow. That ripple effect just compounds the financial stress, especially for lower-income families or small businesses counting on that refund money early in the year.
Absolutely. It disrupts household budgets significantly.
Yeah, and speaking of small businesses, they often feel like the forgotten collateral damage in these political fights. What happens to federal loan programs?
They just freeze, instantly halted. Sources show that during the 2013 shutdown, approximately 700 small businesses had applied for about $140 million in federal loans, SBA loans, for instance. None of those could be processed or approved until the government reopened and funding resumed.
So businesses needing capital to expand, hire, or even just make payroll are just left hanging.
Completely left hanging. And if you track venture capital or the innovation economy, the impact on small business investment company or SBIC license approvals is particularly damaging.
It's BICs. Those
Yeah.
help fund startups, right?
Yes, they leverage private capital alongside government guarantees to invest in promising startups. For every single SBIC license approval that gets delayed or lost due to a shutdown, the economy potentially loses around $175 million in downstream capital investment leverage.
$175 million per license. That's huge potential lost.
It is. These programs are vital engines for job creation and scaling innovative companies, especially in high-tech fields or the defense industrial base. And the approval process is simply frozen solid by the political impasse in Washington.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly to the most vulnerable populations. You mentioned mandatory spending like Social Security continues, but what about programs like SNAP, formerly known as food stamps? The benefits themselves are mandatory, right?
The benefits themselves are mandatory spending, yes, but the administrative mechanisms surrounding the payment, the state agencies that process applications and distribute the funds, the federal oversight that's often funded through discretionary appropriations.
So the plumbing gets clogged even if the water source is okay.
That's a good analogy, because the funding for the administrative staff and the technology needed to process those SNAP benefits relies on those annual discretionary appropriations. A shutdown forces states into emergency maneuvers.
I like what?
They often have to disperse SNAP benefits early, sometimes well before the 20th of the month, using leftover funds or contingency authorities. They do this to try and ensure delivery before their own administrative funding potentially runs out during a prolonged shutdown.
But getting the money early, that sounds good, but does it cause problems?
It does. That altered timing is critical and counterintuitive. Studies based on past shutdowns show that because the money arrives much earlier in the month than usual, this causes predictable, documented shifts in household spending patterns.
How so?
Families may spend more upfront, but then it leads to increased food insecurity later in the month for some low-income families as they struggle to stretch those same funds across a longer period than they're accustomed to.
So even a mandatory program suffers acute negative consequences when the administrative apparatus supporting it fails due to political deadlock.
Precisely. It shows how interconnected everything is. And we also see a dangerous slowdown in other public health functions.
Like what?
Employees responsible for key food safety inspections, as we mentioned, but also product safety checks, workplace safety inspections through OSHA. Many of them are furloughed.
So less oversight on dangerous products or unsafe workplaces.
Correct. Plus, critical background work gets delayed. Preparation for the upcoming flu season, monitoring other emerging public health threats like disease outbreaks, that capacity is diminished, potentially leaving the country more exposed to preventable health risks. #TagV, macroeconomic consequences, and business uncertainty.
Okay, let's zoom out to the bigger economic picture.
Yeah.
The analysis often starts with this somewhat comforting notion that the overall effect of a shutdown on the American economy is usually modest.
You do hear that, yes.
On average, real GDP still grew about 2.2% during past shutdown periods. And the reasoning is usually what?
Yeah.
That they're temporary and federal workers eventually get back pay.
Right. The logic is that shutdowns are typically short. The historical average is just over a week. And since federal workers generally receive retroactive pay, thanks to subsequent legislation, the hit to overall consumer spending is somewhat mitigated. The money eventually flows.
But that perceived modesty, it feels like it masks a very real and sometimes permanent cost, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. That aggregate view hides significant pain and accumulating costs. The 2013 shutdown, which lasted 16 days, was estimated to subtract a very significant $24 billion from the economy.
$24 billion in just over 2 weeks.
Yes, and it trimmed at least 0.6 percentage points from GDP growth in the fourth quarter of 2013. That's not insignificant.
And the longest shutdown, the 2018-2019 one.
That one, according to the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, permanently shaved about $3 billion from GDP.
Okay, that figure, $3 billion permanently lost, that's the number that should really grab our audience's attention. Why permanent? If the workers get back pay eventually, where does that permanent subtraction come from? What's lost forever?
Great question. The permanence comes down to lost productivity, canceled or delayed investments, and disrupted economic activity that simply can't be recovered.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about it. When a key regulatory agency halts an environmental review needed for a major private infrastructure project, That project delay costs real money and time. It might even be canceled.
Or those 10,000 stop work orders on federal contracts we talked about.
Exactly. When those contracts are paused, the work isn't just deferred. Sometimes the window of opportunity closes. Maybe a tech company misses a key deadline for a government deliverable, impacting its next funding round. Or a small business relying on that contract has to lay off workers.
So businesses that delay R&D, cancel hiring plans, or miss a key government contract window because of the chaos, they don't just rewind the clock and recapture that economic activity once the government reopens.
No, often they can't. Market conditions change, opportunities vanish, that economic activity shifts elsewhere, or it just dies completely. That's where the permanent loss comes from. Lost output, lost innovation, lost investment.
And beyond the sheer monetary cost, there's another major impact. The shutdown deprives the entire financial world of crucial, non-negotiable economic information.
This is a huge secondary effect. Federal statistical agencies like the Census Bureau, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they have to delay the release of key economic data points.
We're talking about the really big ones, right? Like the monthly jobs report.
Absolutely. Critical reports like the jobs report, the non-farm payrolls, or NFP, and the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, which measures inflation. These are the bedrock data points that global investors, analysts, and policymakers rely on.
So if a shutdown happens on October 1st, we might not get the initial jobless claims data the following Thursday, or the big NFP report the first Friday of the month. It creates a genuine information blackout.
A total blackout. And if you follow the financial markets, you know this lack of visibility is a major issue. Think about this scenario. What if key inflation data, like the CPI report, is scheduled for release right before a crucial Federal Reserve meeting where they're deciding on interest rates?
And that data just doesn't come out. How does the Fed make a decision?
It paralyzes them, or at least makes their job exponentially harder. The Federal Reserve relies on a steady stream of accurate, timely data to build its economic models of inflation, employment, growth. When that data stream suddenly stops because the agencies producing it are shut down,
the predictive models become unreliable.
Exactly. It severely complicates their decision-making process for monetary policy. Do they raise rates, lower them, hold steady? They're flying partially blind. This uncertainty is a major driver of market volatility, which global markets inherently dislike.
Right. Global markets, stock exchanges, currency markets.
Yeah.
They're incredibly sensitive to U.S. political stability, or lack thereof.
Extremely sensitive. And the primary risk for investors isn't usually that a shutdown itself will cause a recession. Historically, they haven't directly done that.
So what is the big fear for markets?
The big fear, the nightmare scenario, is the potential for a catastrophic credit downgrade to the U.S.'s sovereign credit rating, that AAA status.
Especially if a shutdown were to overlap with a fight over the debt ceiling, right? That seems like the real danger zone.
That scenario becomes exponentially more dangerous, yes. If political dysfunction not only stops appropriations, but also threatens the government's ability to pay its existing debts, that's when rating agencies get really nervous. Fitch Ratings warned explicitly about this combined risk during the 2018-2019 shutdown event.
And the consequence of a credit downgrade, like the one Standard & Poor's did back in 2011 after a debt ceiling fight, it's immediate and severe for basically everyone listening, isn't it?
It is. The U.S. credit rating is the bedrock, the benchmark for global finance. A downgrade makes borrowing instantly more expensive for the U.S. government itself.
Which means higher interest costs for taxpayers down the line.
Correct. But it also pushes up borrowing costs for major corporations and, critically, for American households through higher interest rates on mortgages, car loans, credit cards, everything.
So it's the volatility, the uncertainty, and the potential for that downgrade, not just the temporary closure itself, that are the primary long-term market impacts.
That's a very good summary of the market perspective, yes.
Now, let's bring it back to the ground level. The ripple effect hits the federal contractor community, you mentioned maybe 4 million workers, with devastating force.
It's a huge hit. Federal contractors, especially the smaller businesses that might rely solely or heavily on government work, face massive immediate uncertainty.
Because a shutdown means three things hit them all at once, right?
Right. First, halted funding and severely delayed payments for work already performed. Second, no new contracts can be signed or awarded. And third, perhaps most dramatically, they can receive stop work orders.
And we heard that number before the 2013 shutdown resulted in over 10,000 stop work orders issued across the contracting community. That's an enormous amount of disruption.
It's massive. Imagine getting that notice. Cease all work immediately, uncertain when you can restart or when you'll get paid next.
But the financial pain doesn't even stop there for contractors, does it? Because they can request compensation for the costs they incur due to these federally mandated stops.
Exactly. Under federal contracting regulations, contractors can often request what are called equitable adjustments to their contracts to cover the costs incurred specifically because of the government-caused shutdown or stop work order.
What kind of costs are we talking about?
Things like the cost of maintaining idle facilities, unabsorbed overhead costs during the pause, or the costs of retaining essential personnel on payroll even when there's no work for them to do, just to ensure they're available when work resumes.
And processing thousands of these equitable adjustment requests after a shutdown, that must be complex and add even more cost later.
Extremely complex and time-consuming for both the contractor and the government contracting officers. And ultimately, the final bill for all these adjustments just adds to the overall taxpayer burden once operations resume. It means the political delay ends up costing us far more in the long run than any temporary savings realized during the funding lapse itself.
It's like paying interest on dysfunction.
That's not a bad way to think about it.
And this risk is so real, so predictable now, that we're actually seeing advisory groups and consulting firms issuing detailed guides right now. I saw one from APRIO, dated September 26, 2025, specifically telling businesses how to prepare for the 2025 shutdown.
That tells you everything, doesn't it? This isn't theoretical contingency planning anymore. It's active risk management. Business leaders are executing strategies right now.
What are they advising?
Things like proactive planning, securing lines of credit maybe, emphasizing open communication with their government contracting officers to understand potential impacts, and meticulous documentation of all costs incurred during the disruption to support those equitable adjustment claims later. It's about minimizing the financial strain and ensuring they can hit the ground running once operations resume. #tag stags finals. Reopening and long-term lessons.
Okay, so eventually, maybe after days, maybe weeks, Congress finally passes a continuing resolution, or maybe even a full omnibus spending bill. Funding is restored. But how does the government, this massive administrative behemoth, actually resume operations? It can't be as simple as just flipping a switch back on, can it?
No, it's definitely not that simple. It requires a coordinated effort, and this is actually mandated by the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB.
OMB requires agencies to plan for reopening, too.
Yes. Agency shutdown contingency plans must include detailed procedures for resuming operations efficiently once funding is enacted.
What do those plans involve?
They have to outline the specific method for notifying all the furloughed employees who might be scattered all over the country, maybe even overseas, that the furlough has officially ended and that they are expected to return to work on a specific day and time.
Communication must be key.
Absolutely. Getting the word out quickly and clearly is paramount. The plans also often include providing some flexibility for supervisors, maybe allowing employees to use accrued leave to deal with any return-to-work issues, childcare adjustments, things like that.
And what about the pay situation? We know furloughed workers generally get back pay thanks to laws Congress usually passes after the fact.
That's generally true, yes. The Government Employee Fair Treatment Act of 2019 now mandates retroactive pay for furloughed employees as soon as practicable after the lapse ends.
But what about those accepted employees, the ones who were required to work throughout the shutdown without getting paid?
That's a crucial detail for their financial recovery. Those accepted employees who worked without pay during the funding lapse are entitled not just to their base back pay, but also to any overtime pay, night pay differentials, holiday pay, and other allowances they would have earned as if the work had been performed and paid on time.
So they're made whole, at least financially.
The intent is to make them financially whole, yes. It's a small but critical acknowledgement, given they bore the biggest burden during the lapse by performing those essential functions essentially for free under significant stress.
Yeah, without that guarantee of eventually getting paid, including overtime and allowances, recruiting anyone for those critical accepted roles would probably be impossible.
It would be incredibly difficult, yes.
Now, when we look back at this whole phenomenon, it's striking that government shutdowns in this form are a uniquely American problem and relatively modern, aren't they?
They really are. We've had, as we mentioned, 21 significant funding gaps causing shutdowns since 1980. Before that, funding gaps happened, but agencies generally continued operating under the assumption funding would come through.
So what changed around 1980?
The modern framework was essentially established by two key opinions from Attorney General Benjamin Civletti under President Carter in 1980 and early 1981.
Civletti, okay. What did his opinion say?
They essentially mandated a much stricter interpretation and enforcement of the Anti-Deficiency Act. They concluded that, barring those narrow life and property exceptions, agencies absolutely must cease operations in the absence of appropriations. No more assuming the money would come later.
So that legal interpretation fundamentally altered the landscape. From keep working, the money will show up, to a mandatory stop work order the moment funding laxes.
Exactly. That shift is what institutionalized the modern government shutdown as we know it.
Now, when we analyze this whole messy process, some experts, like those cited from Harvard Law, note that this tension, this push and pull between Congress wielding the power of the purse and the executive branch managing the actual government operations, it's kind of fundamental to our system of checks and balances, isn't it?
It is. The appropriations process, however flawed it often seems in practice, remains one of Congress's most potent tools to exert policy leverage and conduct oversight over the sprawling executive branch and its agencies.
So, while everyone hates the drama and the disruption of shutdowns, completely moving away from time-limited annual appropriations, that could have downsides too.
It could. Imagine, for example, if Congress just passed perpetual multi-year CRs or massive omnibus bills covering years at a time just to avoid the annual fight.
What would be the risk there? Less accountability.
Precisely. If Congress loses that regular annual lever of controlling the purse strings, agency accountability could diminish. Congressional oversight might weaken.
And there's another practical problem with constantly delaying budgets too, right? Even if they avoid a full shutdown.
Yes. When final budgets are only approved late in the fiscal year, maybe 6 months in after multiple CRs, agencies then have less than half the year to actually execute an entire year's worth of funding and programs.
Which leads to...
It often leads to compressed, lower quality budget execution, maybe wasteful spending rushes at the very end of the fiscal year just to get the money out the door. It's inefficient. So there's this necessary tension inherent in the system, even if the way it's currently playing out through shutdowns is terribly flawed and costly.
Well, we have certainly taken a deep dive today into the mechanics and consequences of the 2025 shutdown risk. We've analyzed everything from the impact on military families' paychecks and the freezing of vital federal loan programs,
to the staggering economic disruption caused by delayed data releases and those permanent losses to GDP we discussed.
You, our listeners, have successfully completed your knowledge upgrade on the KaiZen channel. Hopefully, you are now better equipped than almost anyone to understand the precise legal triggers, the human costs, and the economic fill-out of this highly complex and unfortunately cyclical event.
And if we try to connect all these threads back to the bigger picture, it seems the root problem really lies in how that Anti-Deficiency Act is currently interpreted and applied.
The law mandating a complete stoppage of non-accepted functions the moment funds lapse.
Right. A law originally intended, perhaps, for genuine fiscal emergencies, but which is now routinely triggered by, frankly, ordinary political disagreements over spending priorities.
Which raises a really important, maybe provocative question for you, the informed listener, to think about after this. Should the foundational law governing our nation's fiscal responsibility, the Anti-Deficiency Act, be so easily weaponized in routine political disputes, forcing these immense human and economic costs?
Or does the mandatory nature of the shutdown, however painful, still serve a necessary, if blunt, role in ultimately maintaining congressional accountability and control over spending? It's a tough balance.
That's definitely something to chew on. We really want to hear your perspective on the more immediate impacts, too. Thinking about all the disruptions we discussed, national park closures, a lapse in food safety oversight, delays in getting your tax refund. What single-service disruption would affect you or your community the most?
Yeah, what hits closest to home for you?
Pause right now and just share a simple word or phrase in the comments, maybe just parks or food safety or tax delay, to let us know your thoughts. It helps us understand what resonates.
Please do.
And if you found this detailed breakdown helpful, if you feel more informed now, please take just a second right now to like this deep dive.
It really helps the channel.
And subscribe to KaiZen if you haven't already so you don't miss our future analyses. And please, share this with anyone you know, friends, family, colleagues, who needs to understand the true, often hidden, costs of a political budget standoff.
Spread the knowledge.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and stay informed.